systems are designed to think like humans, they act like humans, but they are not going to replace humans. Think rationally, they can act rationally, but both on supervised and unsupervised learning. I would be covering those topics as well. Now, this is Sophia. This is one of, ma'am has already told that, sorry. This is a bit of repetition I was not doing. That is Sophia, and she is the first humanoid robot, and she has been granted Saudi Arabia citizenship as well. Now, what are the fields where AI cover? It covers cognitive learning, computer vision, deep learning, genomics, natural NLPs, machine learning as well. In imaging, I have made a certain stepwise procedural setup so that doctors can know what exactly what is going to happen in these things. Though it provides automation, it provides accuracy, but with the input, that is computer-aided detection systems, quantitative tools, I have marked skill-based, rule-based, knowledge-based, and expertise. These are going to be side by side. These are going to be an inputs to the AI systems. That is skill of the doctor as well of the engineer, rule-based, certain rules in the coding which we have to associate, and also your inputs, that this is the certain limit of something that beyond this limit you cannot set your algorithm, some certain levels of biomarkers or something. You have to provide us that data. Knowledge base is that the initial knowledge which the AI has, it starts from very basics, that is bias and weights. The bias and weights knowledge base means initial weight. So suppose you have a biomarker, what weight you want to give it? Is it a very high on your list? The weightage depending upon how it is affecting your calculations, but obviously your expertise. CAD use computer algorithms and machine learnings to analyze medical images, assisting doctors in detecting and evaluating abnormalities, potentially improving diagnostic accuracy and efficiency. Such as I have given one of the examples, that is how to differentiate between different tumor types, malignant or benign, or it can be glioblastoma multiforme or other lesions, and segregating the infiltrative tumor boundaries. Now, we also have decision support tools for detection and quantification, along with electronic health records, pathology reports, and other patient records to assist with the diagnosis. Now, ma'am has told about the supervised and unsupervised learning. I'm just letting you know what these basics are all about. That is labeled data. Deep learning cannot work without annotations. जब तक डीप लर्निंग आएगा, आपको इनिशियल डेटा एनोटाइज करके हमें इंजीनियर्स को देना ही पड़ेगा. दिस इज द बेसिक्स ऑफ दैट. दैट इज for having an accuracy on a trained data, how that accuracy is being measured. The markings, the annotations done by you are basics of our ground, are the basics, are the ground truth for us. And if we map those with our learnings of the algorithm, then we say that this is the, or if you say this particular feature this is of no use, so then we have to remove that particular feature, and this constitutes our supervised learning. That is, supervised learning is when we teach or train the machine using data that is well labeled. Some data is already tagged. Their internet is having the internet repositories where there is a lot of data, but many of that data has poor quality. They have got noise, or they do not have the annotated data sets. We cannot go, the engineers cannot go without annotations, and they cannot test the data without these supervised learning things. This algorithm is completely opposite to the supervised. The unsupervised ones, there is no complete and clean labeled data sets in supervised learning. It learns from very small basics, from the patterns by itself. And then it is they self-organize themselves. Its main aim is to explore the underlying patterns and predicts the output. Now, what is machine learning in imaging? That improves any computer program that improves its performance at some task through experience to produce an algorithm that can learn patterns inherent in a data set to perform some specified task. So what we do is we extract features. What type of features? Radiomic features. What are those radiomic features? These are first order statistics, second order statistics. First order statistics, simple from mean to standard deviation. And then we have second order statistics. Then we said gray level co-occurrence matrix, gray level recurrence matrices. That are the imaging, depending upon the image pixels. What are the combination of different pixels? Then we classify those, parameters are being fed to the system, and then we classify based on the input features, and we get the desired output. Now, where this machine learning in healthcare is being used, how it affects the healthcare? It can optimize hospital processes such as resource allocation and patient flow, identify the patient groups for personalized and precision medicine, discover new medical knowledge, automate the detection of relevant findings in pathology and radiology, improve quality of care and population health outcomes while reducing healthcare costs, model and prevent spread of hospital-acquired infections. There are the various things where the machine learning algorithms in healthcare can be used. Now, this is a very generic flow diagram of machine learning, where I have summed up all the inputs which can be given to a computer program, to a machine learning program. Data collection is one of the most important steps, including the ethical clearance. Ethical clearance is what we need at the present hour. There shall be collaborations, but this is the main point, where the hospital data includes the laboratory examinations, image data, generic data, e-medical, that is electronic health records, patient characteristics, treatment repositories, follow-ups, histories, and also clinical lab reports. Now, the second thing is data pre-processing. The data which you give us is not normalized at all. You have different systems where you collect the data, you have different imaging modalities, even the setting of the parameters is also very much different. Also, in the e-medical records, there is some, what we say is, there is some data lagging and imbalanced data. If you give us a similar type of diseases, to classify those diseases, then one of the most important thing is data imbalance. Data imbalance is what that for one disease, a similar disease, you have got 100 patients, 100 reports, and for the other one, you have only 20 reports. By this, the model is unable to train itself, because it is what is other thing is, what we say is overtraining, overfitting, underfitting. So these problems arise when we deal with the data imbalance problems. Then we have model selections after data pre-processing, that is bias correction. I'm repeating the data pre-processing steps. There are very much more important steps, that is noise removal. And then we have many filters in those. Those are totally imaging filters. And if we have 1D data, then we say it signal processing filters, where we remove certain set of highly noised data from the all over data sets. Then we go for the model selection, in which we have NLPs or machine learning, that is decision trees or random forest, naive Bayes, and finally we have the training of the model and evaluate the parameters according to the output of the applications. Now, the other thing what we deal with is the deep neural networks. You might have heard about the word CNNs. That is convolution neural networks. The convolution term in itself is convolving the information from the various steps. Convolution was firstly, we just read that thing in digital signal processing in very second year of our textbooks in engineering. Then they move to 2D data, then the 3D data, and is a deep and wide. What deep neural network? It is a deep and wide neural networks, and these utilize algorithms that derive meaningful data using hierarchy of multiple layers that mimics the neural networks of human brain. If we provide the system tons of information, it begins to understand it and respond in a useful way. It can learn increasingly complex features and train complex networks. more specific and move general purpose than hand-engineered features. Why is deep learning useful? Manually designed features are often overspecified, incomplete, and take a long time to design and validate. Learned features are easy to adapt, fast to learn. Deep learning provides a very flexible, universal learnable framework, and it can work on both supervised and unsupervised learning patterns. This is what the traditional ML algorithms and deep learning algorithm accuracies have in the recent past. The sensitivity is above 90%. Even the specificity is above 90%. Now the data sets are being divided into three parts, that is training, validation, and test data sets. What I do in my algorithms is I literally train the data set with 60%, and I keep 40% as unrepetitive, unused data. I just really want to see how the regression models, how these all models are working on the data sets, how the data is being learned and how the output is being affected. Because when you go for the training, though there is a validation data set, what is this validation data set is? This is known as K-folds. That is, some data is being kept by the machine for testing purpose by itself. Now, if we keep the testing data set that is totally unseen, we can see the variations of the patterns as well. What are the basic things which are being learned and what things it is unable to detect, unable to learn the patterns. That is why it's very much important. Rather than go, if you will find the papers, if you will see the initial papers, you will find 90% plus papers, there is 80% and 20% of the divisions of training and testing data set. Try to understand if we are going for 80 to 20% ratios, but obviously there will be overfitting. That is, overfitting means overtraining. You're training the same type of data sets to the system, and it will behave accordingly. If I give you 10 sums of plus and the same pattern is being repeated in your end-sum test, but obviously if the same values are being given, you would perform better. That is why it's better to have 30 to 40% data and unrepetitive test data in the testing sets. This is what underfitting and overfitting is. That is, underlying patterns poorly are being captured by the model. It's too simple for the complexity of the data, insufficient training, and there is low variance. And whereas overfitting, they have irrelevant details, excellent performance on the data, but poor performance on new data. That is what I'm saying. Keep your data sets, as when you are dealing with the engineers, tell them to have 60% of the training data set and 30 to 40, 60 to 70 of the training, and 30 to 40 unseen, unrepetitive data. Now, these are few of the evaluation matrices, that is accuracy, precision, recall, sensitivity. The sensitivity can reach up to 90 plus 95 to 98%, but specificity cannot. If you have 85 to 90% of the specificity, kindly go through these things as well, that this is much more efficient. This means, again, I'm saying the same word, that your model is not overtrained. Now, F1 score is also known as a dissimilarity coefficient. It is being used when you have 1D data, laboratory tests, we generally go for F1 score, and the other naming is dissimilarity coefficient when we deal with the imaging data, that it is a statistical measure to evaluate the similarity between two sets of data to assess the overlap. Now, what is this overlap of the data is that what you deal with, your annotations. That is your supervised data, your markings when you give us the data. Now, I have got the few publications and the recent past where I have marked 3D imaging, 3D tumor imaging, and this is the view of the segmented 3 regions of the tumor. And this is what we made. This is the actual, this is how much coding and work we go through to reach the outputs. And it's very detailed versions where we convolve many filters, 3D filters, five windows, 3D windows, concatenate those layers. Then we have max pooling layers, convolution layers, and finally we get the 3 boundaries, 3 whole tumor and those tumor boundaries in the image itself. This is how it looks when it is a 2D imaging, and this is what it looks in a 3D imaging. Now, finally moving to explainable AI. Now this is the recent explainable and crystal AIs. Oh, just, okay, sir. I will be. Now, this is one of the diagrams, what I'm saying, that we have in the machine learning, now the improved version of machine learning, that is explainable AI. Now it includes LIME and SHAP. This is what it generates local approximations and contribute most to the specific predictions. And these divide into segmenting the image into regions, and then these regions are being understood by the algorithm. And it also, the other one is SHAP. It goes for the Shapley features, and we have global and local explanations providing insights into the overall model, and it determines the contribution of each feature to the model prediction. Now, finally, moving to the cardiac imaging, we have image processing techniques. The system aims to accurately segment and quantify arterial calcifications from cardiac OCT images. Now, these approaches enhances diagnostic precision, reduces manual effort, and support clinicians in early detection and treatment planning. This is from the literature survey, where we have got the accuracy of 93.2%. See, here the dice similarity coefficient is only 0.693%, and it is not bad. Seriously, overlap regions with the doctor markings, it's good enough. Now, again, there is one of the with a F1 score of 94%, and this is a sensitivity or specificity. I already told you it shall be from 85 to 90%. That means your algorithm is working good. You have not to go for higher ranges. It's good if you are having from 85 to your sensitivity or your accuracy can be 98 to 97%. So this is what we are planning to do for segmenting arterial calcification from cardiac imaging data. But obviously the problem is about the ethical clearance, and Rakesh sir and we are planning for the for clearing of those ethical commitments. And in the development of deep learning models for AI-based algorithms of flow dynamics and risk stratification in coronary artery aneurysms and Kawasaki disease using CT angiography. This is a project we are hoping to do. That is the impact of CAs on flow hemodynamics in children with KD, and using advanced computational techniques such as deep learning in AI to analyze flow dynamics in CAs using CTCA image-based data. And can these be integrated to improve risk stratification and long-term outcomes in KD patients with CAs? Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. So, I understand it's a completely new area for us, and we must be having a lot of questions, but in the interest of time, we'll move on to the next session. So, any questions, you can always discuss in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
So the matter of the moment of this conference is Kawasaki disease. What predisposes one to get and what makes the other child not get. So we used to think our fate was in our stars, but now in large measure we know it is in our genes. So to chair the next session, I invite Dr. Professor Saji Philip. He is the founder president of Kawasaki Disease Foundation of India and Indian Society of Kawasaki Disease.
We are half an hour behind the schedule, and I request all the speakers to keep the time exactly what they look. Next talk will be on genetics. Genetics of Kawasaki disease, a blog update by Dr. Amir Rao. He's a professor of and the area of your research is on complement deficiency and primary immunodeficiency diseases. Various publications, and over to Dr.
Thank you, Dr. Saji, for the kind introduction. And the topic I would be talking on is genetics of Kawasaki disease, a global update. So when we talk about genetic variants in any disease, this is a useful figure to look at. So you have some rare or ultra-rare variants which are associated with a high effect size, and the Mendelian diseases, which is the Mendelian pattern of inheritance, would fall here. Whereas if you have common variants in common diseases, for example, diabetes or hypertension, you will be having common variants which are very common in the population, but the effect size, I mean the effect of that variant on the phenotype will be very little. So the common diseases with the common variants will fall here, and low frequency variants with intermediate effect will solve somewhere between, and that can be outliers in the both spectrums. You could have rare variants with very little effect, or you could have common variants with very high effect size. So the genetic analysis in Kawasaki disease has evolved over the time. Initial studies featured using candidate gene approach. The most common genes studied were HLA genes, because HLA has been associated with a lot of diseases, especially autoimmune diseases earlier. And non-HLA genes were also studied. And when the genome technology was made available, then we had genome-wide association studies, genome-wide linkage studies, and also now we have a few studies using whole exome and whole genome sequencing. So coming to the earlier studies, this is the first paper on the MHC associations in Kawasaki disease from Japan, where they found, they looked specifically at the MHC class 1 genes, specifically MHC class 1, HLA-A and HLA-B. And what they found was that certain alleles which have been boxed here were more common in Japanese children with Kawasaki disease, specifically HLA-B W22J, which is a specific HLA allele found in the Japanese children with Kawasaki disease. Subsequently, there were more papers on HLA antigens in Kawasaki disease from Japan, but also from New England and US, and also from the Korean population. These are some of the studies which have been highlighted in this table. So, this was done in different populations. Some alleles were common, but there were some which were specific to different populations and ethnicities. Non-HLA genes, as I've highlighted, also been studied, and you had earlier heard a talk from Dr. Vibhu. So this FC gamma receptor family genes have also been implicated both with the susceptibility to KD and also with coronary artery aneurysm formation. And this has also been studied in the context of susceptibility and formation of coronary artery lesions in KD. And this is the diagram to show the structural homology in the different FCGR genes. And also there are copy number variations which are very difficult to study by usual methods of sequencing. In the non-HLA genes, there are other genes also, most importantly the matrix metalloproteinases genes and also the chemokine receptors. And this table just highlights that. This was a large study from the US where they looked at familial occurrence of Kawasaki disease, and there were 18 families, and in families 1 to 9 there were 2 siblings which were affected, and the rest of the families, family 10 to 18, they showed what they called complex pedigrees, where more than one generation or multiple individuals were affected. And in this, altogether in this family 10 to 18, there were 25 affected individuals. And this was another study where they looked at the candidate genes. This was a candidate gene approach, and they looked at, I think, 55 genes which were involved in both inflammation and cardiovascular disease. And with data analysis, they found that IL-4 locus, they first honed down to the long arm of chromosome 5, and then they found that the IL-4 was significantly associated with susceptibility to Kawasaki disease. But the first paper on the genome-wide analysis of Kawasaki disease was with the Professor Onuchi, Yoshihiro Onuchi from Japan, where he showed that there was a linkage to a locus on chromosome 12. Following this, this was the landmark paper in Nature Genetics, where again from the Japanese cohort of Kawasaki disease, where they showed that a polymorphism in the intron 1 of the ITPKC gene. ITPKC stands for inositol triphosphate 3 protein kinase C, and this is a negative regulator of T cell activation. And this particular aneurysm was, this particular SNP was associated not only with the Kawasaki disease susceptibility, but also to the formation of coronary artery aneurysms. And this figure here shows the ITPKC SNP in the intron 1 of the ITPKC gene, and the effect of this SNP on the splicing. And this figure here shows that this the ITPKC gene is a negative regulator of T cell activation, and this SNP resulted in increased inflammation that was seen in Kawasaki disease. Another paper, which was again published from the Japanese group by Professor Yoshihiro Onichi, was in the ORAI gene. This gene is important in calcium channel signaling, which is important for T cell activation. So these are some of the genes which are associated with different pathways in KD. So you have got genes which are involved in the calcium channel signaling and T cell activation. ITPKC is a negative regulator, ORAI1 and STIM are positive regulators. You have got genes involved in B cell signaling, the CD40 gene, the BLK, the B linker gene, and also a locus on the immunoglobulin heavy chain. And then you've got others like TGF beta signaling and caspase 3, which is involved in apoptosis. So there are multiple genes involving different pathways which have been studied in different populations and ethnicities. So this was a replication study of this ITPKC and the caspase 3 polymorphism in the Taiwanese population, where they're trying to see whether co-occurrence of these two polymorphisms was associated with coronary artery lesions or a responsiveness to IVIG. Though they were able to show that the co-occurrence of these two polymorphisms in a given patient increased the likelihood of a coronary artery abnormality, but it was not significant enough for the data was not significant for the IVIG responsiveness. This was again a paper from the Korean group where they showed that this SNP in the high mobility group box protein 1 was associated with both coronary artery aneurysms and also resistance to IVIG. So this was the data for the coronary artery aneurysm, where you can see that the risk allele GG in the homozygous form or in the heterozygous form was associated with, significantly associated with the risk of development of coronary artery aneurysms compared to the wild type allele. And similarly, the same polymorphism in the this HMGB1 gene was associated with resistance to IVIG as well. And these are some of the genes which I've highlighted which are associated with the resistance to IVIG. This was one paper where they have used whole genome sequencing to look at genetic variants in patients with Kawasaki disease. This was a Afro-American family from the US where 2 of the 4 children were affected with KD, and they did whole genome sequencing in the parents and also the 4 siblings, and they found compound heterozygous rare variants in the TLR6 gene in these 2 affected siblings. And in addition, they found other SNPs in the TLR6 gene in this family. This was the pipeline they used to come to these 2 variants. And they did some functional analysis also, and it showed that the genotype, this particular allele was also associated with transcript levels of interleukin 6, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. This was a study, this was a multi-center study where data was to develop a diagnostic test for KD. As we know, there is no pathognomic diagnostic test for KD. So in this, they looked at a cohort of KD patients from Japan, from US, from Europe, and what they did was a gene expression array. It was not RNA sequencing, it was a gene expression array where they looked at 30,000 genes with around 47,000 probes, and they came up with this 13 transcript gene signature, which could classify the patients of KD from other diseases. These 13 genes include some genes which are regulated to immune pathways like the CD163, the interferon alpha inducible protein 27, but there are some other genes also, like the zinc finger proteins, the reticulon, the S100P. So these were the 13 genes which they shortlisted from this transcription array study. And when they compared this, so this is KD. So there were two sets, as has been highlighted earlier. This was the discovery set. This is the validation set. In the discovery set, they had KD. They have got definite bacterial, definite viral, unclassified, JIA and HSP. As you can see, that it was able to discriminate KD from other causes, and also in the training in the validation set also, it was able to, this 13 gene signature was able to discriminate KD definite or highly probable from other causes which may mimic KD, like probable KD, definite bacterial, definite viral, or undefined etiology. So the new, what has been new in the recent years, so this is the study from the European cohort. It was from US and Europe and also UK, where patients of Caucasian ancestry were enrolled for the study. And they found this novel intergenic locus on chromosome 20, which was associated with coronary artery aneurysm. And also they validated other SNPs which have been already reported, like the ITPKC, and also the SNP in the FCGR2A gene. So this is a Manhattan plot here, which shows that this is the Manhattan plot showing the GWAS for coronary artery aneurysm. And as you can see, there are variants in the intergenic region of chromosome 20, which has been highlighted in the regional plot here. And these are the ones for the susceptibility to KD. And then again, the regional plot showing the different SNPs which were found in this study. So to conclude, the genetic susceptibility to KD can involve different genes. It can be just KD susceptibility. It could be genes associated with aneurysm formation, or it could be genes which confer resistance to IVIG. And this could be genes which influence the immune system, or it could be other genes. And then there are some genes which are involved in T cell signaling through the calcium channels involved. So you've got genes like your ORAI, STIM1, which are involved in, which are calcium channel regulators, or ITPKC, which is a negative regulator. And then it causes the SNP in this causes the activation of T cells, or you could have other regions which influence the immune system, like CD40, TLR6, IL4, BLK. But the problem with these studies is that there are some genes which have been validated in different cohorts, like the ITPKC, the FCGR2A has been validated with different cohorts. But there are others which are specifically found in one population, like the immunoglobulin heavy chain locus is found only in the Asian population, specifically the Japanese, and it has not been validated in other cohorts. So I think probably it's true. I mean, it would be wise to think that there is a genetic susceptibility, which may not be monogenic, but a polygenic inheritance, which predisposes the individual, and upon an environmental insult or trigger leads to the KD. Thank you very much. And this mnemonic for KD I found while I was preparing for the lecture. So it's called CRASH, and it was crash and burn. I don't know, the burn is for Jane Burns, because it was coined by a house staff at the Rady Children's Hospital. So it was crash and burn. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the next topic also on genetic of Kawasaki is the Indian scenario. Then after that, maybe one or two questions can be from the floor.
Thank you, sir. For the next talk, I invite Dr. Rakesh Kumar Pilania, Associate Professor of Pediatric Allergy Immunology Unit.
So for next talk, I invite my colleague and friend and will be talking on the genetics of Kawasaki disease in Indian scenario. So, where are we in the genetics of Kawasaki disease?
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rakesh, for the introduction and for calling me your friend. So, any talk which you have to give after Professor Rawat, you know, it really stresses me out because I mean, the bar is set so high, but I'll try to do justice to the 15 minutes that have been allotted to me. So I've been asked to cover the genetics of Kawasaki disease in the Indian scenario. So what I'll do is I'll just talk about all the work that's been done in India. But before I move to that, I'll just like to drive a point which probably the audience is, you know, already well versed with, that the probable acute infection because of this family of viruses in a host with the genetic predisposition can lead to an aberrant immune response and finally leads to development of the constellation of symptoms that we know as Kawasaki disease. So this is the model which is, you know, mostly accepted. And so this triad of infection in the background of genetics leading to an aberrant immunity is what defines KD. And today I'll just concentrate on the genetic component, and this has been really nicely described by Amit sir. So this is just to let you know that these are the main genes which are known to be involved in you know, the genetics of KD, and I'll concentrate on this few of these genes on the studies that have been done in India. So as I've driven this point earlier also, why talk about genetics? The main 3 points would be the skewed epidemiology that we know, and the fact that the incidence in Japan is similar to the incidence amongst Japanese settled in Hawaii, and the fact that the occurrence in sibling is also reported. So this all kind of hints towards a possible genetic background to this disease. So these are some of the papers, but what I've done is I'll probably walk you through these papers one by one. But before that, let me just overwhelm you with this really complicated picture and also tell you that this is how diversity operates. Do not look at the penguins, they all look the same, but diversity in our genome is at different levels. You know, it can be at the level of DNA, RNA, or at the level of protein. And you know, the interesting thing is this diagram is not new. This is from 2013. So even in 2013, we knew that, you know, diversity can happen at all these levels. But what we've kind of really concentrated at in India is looking at just the different SNPs which can be involved in the pathogenesis of KD. So other than this, you know, there is so many other things which are waiting to be discovered. But I'll just talk a bit about our experience in Chandigarh. This is the first study which I'd like to highlight, more so because this really drives home the point that looking at genetics is important, because the alleles reported in this study were taken from a study in Japan and where it was found to be significantly associated. But as you can see that in our center, we only found a significant association in one risk allele. So this really drives home the point that these studies are needed to be performed in different ethnicities and in much larger groups to really understand what is happening and what are the significant association between the different risk alleles. So this another paper from our center talks about the single nucleotide polymorphisms in the caspase-3. Amit sir has already told us about the role of caspase-3 in the pathogenesis, but so in this study we aim to look at the association of this alleles in this caspase-3 gene, and we found that there was a significant association between this risk allele with the development of CAAs in patients. ORAI1, which is known to be involved in the calcium signaling, and this is another important gene in the pathogenesis of KD. And sorry, I skipped a few slides. And in this, we found that there was no significant difference in our cohort. But again, you know, these are very small studies and have to be extrapolated to much larger groups. So another study by Dr. Pratap Patra, who is already sitting here, he has looked at the role of the CD40 gene polymorphisms. Although he could not find a significant association in the genetic polymorphisms, but he did report the higher expression of CD40 in patients with Kawasaki disease as compared to the control group. So Dr. Ankita decided to look at the role of thrombomodulin gene. So the role of this gene is a gray area even in the global literature. Truly speaking, whether this gene influences the plasma levels of thrombomodulin is not clear. But in her study, she did find that there was a correlation, but the role of polymorphisms with the development of KD or the CAAs was not found to be statistically significant. Next, I think this is one of the earliest studies from our unit, and in this, Dr. Costa decided to look at the role of the RANTES or the CCL5, the polymorphisms reported in this gene. So in this, again, he found that patients with CAA had a higher frequency of the minor allele. So this basically is involved in the recruitment of the different cells such as the T cells, monocytes, and the granulocytes, and also in the immunomodulation by polarizing the response because of the M2 macrophages. So this is a recent study by Dr. Manish. He looked at the association of the single nucleotide polymorphisms of TGF-beta, which is known to be a cardiovascular, involved in cardiovascular remodeling. So in this case, he did find some significant, polymorphisms in his cohort. So this is just a really, very simplistic view of the work that has been done. But again, this brings us to the question that what more can be done. So recently, the collaborative effort by Genome India, they have published this database of the 1,000 Indian genomes. So this is a very interesting group. I mean, and the call is already open. If you wish, you can have access to the data. If you give them a big proposal about how you will save the data and you will keep the data sharing policies in place. So from this, we can actually build the reference genome for the Indian patients. And again, this can be then, used to look at the polymorphisms and, revisit all this data in the context of the Indian population. So this initiative is by India, but many other countries have already published, and, this data keeps on getting updated regularly. And now we've really looked at the DNA. So what next? So, this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is really interesting because other than DNA, there can be variations in RNA. RNA can also be involved in looking at the genetic complexity in these patients. So RNA can be of different kinds, as we know, microRNA, long non-coding, so on and so forth. But the work that we've done in our group is to look at the differentially expressed genes to delineate common pathways involved in KD. So this paper was published from my unit, and this is just a simple reanalysis which I did to see which neutrophil genes are involved, and by drawing this string interacting network, we could see that the genes involved in neutrophil regranulation are actually, significantly important in patients with KD. So Dr. Aparna decided to, take this up as her DM thesis, and she actually validated a number of big gene sets using real-time PCR in the lab, and she found many upregulated and downregulated genes which were reported from the bioinformatic analysis. So this is just a reanalysis of her data to look at how the interacting networks operate. So other than this, we've also looked at the role of microRNAs in Kawasaki disease. This is from the global data, and they've reported a number of microRNAs which have been implicated in pathogenesis of KD, and they're significantly higher during the acute stage. And they're also associated with IVIG resistance. But in our unit, Dr. Himanshi has actually evaluated these two microRNAs, 145 and 320A, in our cohort and compared them to the febrile controls, and she found a decreased expression of these two microRNAs, but no difference in this microRNA. So once we've, moved on, we've looked at the DNA, the RNA, so what else is left? So there can be epigenetic variations also. Although we've not really studied this work in detail, but a review was published from our center talking about the role of epigenetics in KD. And, from this review, certain genes have been, shorted out, which could have a role in KD because of the different methylation pattern in these genes, and they may be associated with the formation of CAAs. So this is an exciting avenue which can be explored in future studies. Sorry. So just to summarize, since we're already running short of time, I tried to be as fast as I possibly could. So, there are many directions which genetics can take us. We can look at, as Amit sir has already described out the whole genome, sequencing, epigenetics can be looked into more detail. This can lead to more personalized therapies, and obviously, precision medicine can be another takeaway from this. And also we can develop some polygenic risk scores, because till date, Kawasaki disease is not a monogenic disorder. So finally, with the advent of this 10,000 genomes, I feel like the call of the hour is to really have some collaborative, multicentric studies, a big cohort of these patients, evaluate them by using all the cutting edge tech which is available now, and really, understand the different genes and their polymorphisms, or try to understand the genetic basis of this disease. With this, I thank you for your time, and I think Amit sir will take up any further questions.
Thank you, Manpreet, and both talks are open for the questions or comments. And
that many with the KD slide. So when you